Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Health Bites. We are so glad you're here with us. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Joel Bervell. Joel is a third-year Ghanaian-American medical student at Washington State University's Elson Floyd College of Medicine. In 2017, Joel graduated from Yale University, where he earned a BA in molecular cellular developmental biology. There, Joel served as an elected member of Yale student government and director of a longitudinal mentorship program. At Washington State University, Joel served as medical student council president and the co-founder and president of a chapter of the Student National Medical Association. He's committed to fighting health disparities in medicine through education and regularly shares topics about racial disparities in healthcare and other industries on his TikTok and Instagram at Joel Bervell, where his platforms have over 300,000 combined followers and over 17 million impressions. He's been invited to speak on panels at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Clinton Foundation, Open Society Foundations, and more. He has also spoken on national media outlets, including NPR and WebMD, and regularly produces digital media content for Al Jazeera and Brute Media. He currently is working with the World Health Organization's Digital Communications, a collection of health professionals combating the spread of misinformation on social media about COVID-19, and on a diversity, equity, and inclusion project with the VA hospital system. In today's Health Bites, Joel will give a presentation called New Media, New Advocacy, How Racial Bias is Being Tackled in Medicine. Thank you so much, Joel, for being our guest speaker this morning, and I will turn everything over to you.
Thank you so much, Bailey and Edward. I appreciate that. I'm actually going to share my screen, so I'm going to take over from here. That way it makes it easier to do the slides. And I'll start off by kind of having my face on here, but I'm actually going to go off camera in a little bit, but I'll still be talking. But first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. As Bailey mentioned, this talk is called New Media, New Advocacy, How Racial Bias is Being Tackled in Medicine. It's been something that I've been really passionate about over the past few months, but honestly for a lifetime. And I think in today's age where we have social media and we have all these different tools that we can use to spread information, it's all that more important to understand how we're able to disseminate information and also dispel myths that still exist in the medical system. So just a little bit of disclosures, I always like to start with that. I do receive funding from the TikTok Creator Fund. It's a fund that just gives funds based on views, but no formal affiliation there. And if you want to see some of my work, I'll be showing a little bit today, but I talk a lot about it both on Instagram and on TikTok, and it's my name at Joel Bervell. Okay, and then today's objectives, there's three main objectives that we have today. First, to examine how medicine has been both complicit and a reflection of inequities in our society. Second, to understand the history and use of race-based medicine and how in present day it continues to impact the care that patients receive. And third, to analyze and think about solutions to maintaining health equity from a public health and medical standpoint. Okay, so who am I? So as I mentioned, my name is Joel Bervell. I'm a third-year medical student right now at Washington State University. I'm originally from the Seattle, Washington area, where I grew up most of my life, but a lot of people don't know this. I was born in Canada, and both of my parents from Ghana, West Africa. I became interested in health disparities research from a pretty young age, particularly because I had parents that came from Ghana. When I was in middle school, my sister started a nonprofit called Hugs for Ghana, and it was to raise school supplies, medical supplies, and sports equipment for children in Ghana, West Africa. As kind of the years went on and I became part of the organization and kind of taking it over, one of the things I was noticing was health inequities that existed on a global standpoint. But when I got to college, I began to realize that those health inequities exist here at home as well. And I began wanting to dive deeper into understanding how they exist. And I was kind of shocked to see that there's a legacy of racism that's been built out of the fact that the United States was built on slavery, and that still exists, especially here in the medical system. That's what we're going to be getting into a lot today. So in order to identify the source of the problems that still exist, we really have to take it back to history, to take it all the way back to the original scientists that started out, and to realize that medical disparities are part of an ongoing narrative that have started from early on and still continue to persist today. So we're going to be asking how have racial biases rolled over into today's medical practice, and how has that history still impacted that care? And then giving some examples of how medical education perpetuates disparities, and also how healthcare systems can perpetuate that disparity as well. So I always like to start off by thinking about the scientists who defined race, because these people, their legacy and their impact still has so much control over the things that we see today, even though they're long gone now. So Carlos Linnaeus, he was an 18th century Swedish naturalist who defined 4 different types of people. He was among one of the first scientists to ever sort and categorize human beings. And that really has become the foundation for which many countries, including the United States, built their racial policies. What Linnaeus did was he divided the species Homo sapiens into 4 basic varieties, and he divided them based on geography and also mapped humans onto 4 different geographic regions. So he characterized these groups by noting color, humor, and posture in that order. And none of these categories were supposed to originally imply ranking of someone's worth, but that is how it became used in the end. So the way he used this taxonomy was he used the 4 humors. So the 4 humors are blood, phlegm, color, and melancholy, which kind of stood for the colors. And depending on which of the substances dominated, he defined a person or a group of people as that specific color. So a person that would be sanguine would be the cheerful realm of blood. Someone that was phlegmatic would be sluggish. Someone that was choleric would be prone to anger, or someone that was melancholic would be sad. And so for the 4 geographic regions, he defined those 4 humors, he defined those 4 races. So for American variety, Linnaeus wrote that he defined Europeans as red, choleric, and upright. So kind of saying that they were more angry, but also more stronger as well. For Asian individuals, he wrote white, sanguine, and for Asian individuals, he wrote pale yellow, melancholy, and stiff. And then for Africans, he wrote black, phlegmatic, and relaxed. And so really as you can probably hear, a lot of these stereotypes still exist today, in that he used these colors to define people based on the humors and tried to kind of create a connection between the two. But these types of beliefs still exist today, even just how we see individuals. The next person I want to talk about is Johann Blumenbach, and he was a German scientist. He coined the term Caucasian in 1795. He used it to describe people from Europe's eastern border near the Mount Caucasus. And what he did was he claimed that it was that the Caucasians were the original race and thus the most beautiful as well. And then the third person was Samuel George Morton. He was an American anthropologist. In the mid 1800s, he theorized that intelligence was linked to brain size. And what he did was he measured a large number of skulls from around the world. Afterwards, he concluded that whites have larger skulls than other races and that were therefore superior. But it was really the work of important scientists like Samuel Morton at the time that gave racism its legitimacy. Journalists, teachers, preachers, they all began to popularize those findings. And historians who were studying at the time even noted that you didn't have to read obscure books to know that Caucasians were innately superior and that they were responsible for the civilization of the world, or to know that inferior races were destined to be overwhelmed or even to disappear. So really, what Morton did was he took the things that Linnaeus and Blumenbach had been seeing and really tried to put a hierarchy to saying, these individuals are better, these individuals are worse. And not surprisingly at this time, people that questioned scientists like Morton were ignored or marginalized. A German professor, Friedrich Tiedemann, at the time, tried to replicate Morton's work on studying skulls, but he couldn't find any results at all. And he also found no evidence for Morton's racial hierarchy that he was saying, the latter that Caucasians were at the top and Africans were at the bottom. But unfortunately, Tiedemann's work did not attract much attention, and it was ignored and dismissed as unscientific. So what we see from these first 3 individuals is they built off of each other. Linnaeus first kind of categorizing how we're going to look at different people based on the humors. Blumenbach then framing the term Caucasian, and then Morton really putting a hierarchy to this and saying that Caucasians are at the top, Africans are at the bottom. And unfortunately, these things have continued, and you'll see how in a little bit. But I want to make sure I mention Samuel Cartwright too, because in 1851, he was an American physician, and he hypothesized a term called drapetomania. And that was considered a mental illness in which when slaves would run away, he would say that that was actually a mental illness for those slaves running away. And so it shows also how medicine has been complicit in using science in order to try and put mental illnesses against people of a specific race. So why was it fashionable for many white Americans at the time to deny the humanity of Africans and other races? Frederick Douglass, I'm sure we've all heard about, was an abolitionist, most prominent in the 19th century, and he was a firm opponent of slavery in the United States. He argued that the idea that Africans were less than human was important at the time, because the whole argument was in defense of slavery became worthless the moment that Africans were proven equal to a man with the European. So there's a temptation then to say that someone that was African or a slave was not human or was not equal was important in order to actually uphold the entire system that was built. But unfortunately, it still had impacts today. So moving forward in history a little bit, um, looking at Samuel Cartwright and how that's actually played into and become codified in science and medicine, we can look further at some of the things that Samuel Cartwright did. So one thing was Samuel Cartwright created what's called a spirometer. So during the outbreak of tuberculosis in the 19th century, he took interest to the modern spirometer. And originally, spirometers were meant to assess the fitness of police forces, military personnel, and also even life insurance applicants in England. So medicine and public health, originally the spirometer was really just to better understand how people's capacity worked. But Cartwright also saw it as a way to compare lung function of Black slaves to white slave owners. And the application of Hutchinson in 1811 spirometer quickly spread across Atlantic to physicians like Samuel Cartwright. So Cartwright was a Southern doctor, he worked on a plantation, and he also saw value in using it to assess fitness of slaves to see who was better, who wasn't better. He went one step further though to also become to use this tool to compare Black people and white people. Later, Jay Gould, though, would conduct a study on anthropometrical data of Black and white soldiers, and he wrote in a paper about the statistics of American soldiers. It was one of the first racial comparisons of lung capacity with a large sample size, and he asserted in multiple studies with the help from spirometry numbers that slaves had poor nutrition status and higher rates of pneumonia, high rates of typhoid fever, respiratory illnesses, without actually accounting for the bleak living conditions of the then emancipated slaves. So he arrived at the same conclusion as Cartwright, that Black individuals have deficient lungs, and was even quantified to be 20% less than compared to white individuals. The things that these ideas set in motion, though, exist even till today. So if we look at Up to Date, which is one of the resources that physicians can use to really understand and look at different conditions, it still says healthy African Americans have spirometric values that are approximately 12% lower than Americans of Caucasian descent of the same age, sex, and height. And then it goes on to say that the difference is in part due to the difference in the ratio of trunk size to standard height, African Americans having longer legs for a given height, and genetics and nutritional factors as well. But really, what this is even based off of is all these people originally that were using the spirometer on slave populations. Yet we still today automatically in equations actually have racial corrections that assume worse lung functioning for Black patients, for Latinx patients, and for Asian patients. So it's really what I'm hoping you're seeing is the connection between starting history, the things that these individuals were researching, even though it wasn't rigorous science, and how it still to this day has impacts on the ways that we deliver care as physicians and as healthcare professionals. And the racial taxonomy is used to justify everything from segregation to eugenics. So J. Philip Rushton in Race, Evolution, and Behavior said, on average, Orientals are slower to mature, less fertile, less sexually active, less aggressive, have larger brains, higher IQ scores. Blacks are at the other pole. Whites fall in the middle, but close to Orientals than Blacks. That was in 1999. Charles Murray, the bell curve intelligence in class in American Life, said the average Black and white difference in IQ at every level of socioeconomic status, but they differ more at high levels of SES than at low levels. And then Jason Richwine said, no one knows whether Hispanics will ever reach IQ parity with whites, but the prediction that new Hispanic immigrants will have low IQ children and grandchildren is difficult to argue against. So what we see is these ideas from the beginning, from the slavery era that were used in order to uphold slavery, as Frederick Douglass said, still exist today and are perpetuated by people who say these types of things. One thing we should also look at is kind of how medicine has caused disparities outside of biology as well. So beyond the impact of biological basis of race, medicine has also been complicit in health inequities. The professionalism of American medicine culminated in the establishment of the AMA in 1847. But segregation and racism within the medical profession has continued and to profoundly impact communities of color, even though it's not has not been acknowledged a lot until recently. So, for example, the AMA's Council on Medical Education, which commissioned Dr. Abraham Flexner with the Carnegie Foundation, went to look at the allegedly deplorable state of medical education in the 1900s. And Flexner visited all of the North American medical schools and wrote a document that criticized the education of doctors. What he did was he proposed a framework for the proper preparation of physicians that resembled the curriculum of his alma mater, which is Johns Hopkins. So that was 2 years of academics and then 2 years of clinical training recognized in medical education that we do today still. After the Flexner reforms, many medical schools closed though, and 5 of the 7 established schools to train Black individuals were closed, and then all but 1 to train women were closed as well. What that did was it sharply limited the opportunities to enter medicine for marginalized groups. And until the 1960s, civil rights laws made discrimination by race and sex. And it wasn't until the 1960s that civil rights laws made discrimination by race and sex unlawful. So the Flexner Report, in effect, just took out the opportunity for a whole entire generation of marginalized groups to be able to go into the field of medicine. And one thing that I'll talk about a little bit later is the need for people that are from diverse backgrounds to be in the field of medicine to actually make a change. Because if you don't have people from different communities, you're not going to recognize those problems. So this report was in part responsible for the disproportionately low number of Black physicians that we have today. I mean, it's crazy to think, but in 1920, African Americans were 2.5% of US physicians. And that number persisted until only recently, when representation rose from 2.2% in 2008 to 5% today. And today, the number of Black men in medicine has continued to remain at low numbers. There was actually more Black men in medicine in 1978 than there was in 2015. And I really hope that sinks in to show just how significant this problem has become. And the AMA, even before the Flexner Report, also barred Black physicians from joining. And so they refused to admit Black doctors. Now, in response to that, the NMA was founded in 1895. Even up until the 1960s, though, when the AMA membership was important to help hospital practices, specialty training, and professional achievement, many chapters and private societies were still closed to Blacks. It wasn't until 2008 that an official apology from the national organization of the AMA was actually released. And the AMA recently recognized racism as a public health threat. But these are all examples of institutionalized discrimination in medicine that we really becomes ingrained and encoded in the ways that medicine works, and then has impacts down the line on care and leads to many of the issues that we still see today. So one thing I always like to talk about too is defining the 4 dimensions of racism and just what does racism look like. I think we all understand individual racism or that internalized racism. It's the things that we hear about often, what we learned about in school. It's the slurs, it's the attacks on individual people. But racism has 4 different dimensions. It can be internalized, meaning there's subtle and overt messages that reinforce negative beliefs of self-hatred in individuals. And one place I like to put point for that is things like media, which often say specific people have to look in a certain way and can then become internalized. There's interpersonal, which are those racial acts and also microaggressions that are carried out from one person to another. There's structural, which is what I'm really trying to focus on here, which is where multiple institutions collectively uphold racist policies and practices, aka society. And then there's institutional, which is policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workplace or an organization. So these are kind of the 4 dimensions of racism. But in looking at race, as I've mentioned, race is socially constructed. It's a classification that was created by Linnaeus and a whole bunch of other scientists, which was meant to assign human worth and social status using white as a model of humanity for the purpose of establishing and maintaining that privilege and power. Racism, then, is any action, practice, law, speech, or incident which has the effect of undermining anyone's human right based on race or their actual or perceived ethnic or natural or national origin or background, and where that background is that of a marginalized, historically subordinated group. And many people have probably heard this, but racism needs that power dynamic where one person has the power and another race does not have the power. And then there's systemic racism, And that's the form of racism that's embedded in the normal practices within society or an organization. It can lead to discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, politics, education, and of course, healthcare. And so that's what I kind of want to transition into next, is what does systemic racism look like in the healthcare field and medicine? And I think when I came into medical school, I did not realize how ingrained it was in the different places. And as I've kind of gone deeper into it, I've seen how systemic racism is, like it says, embedded into these practices and actually can make huge differences in how people receive care. So I like to split up into three different groups of looking at things like medical education versus race-based medicine versus medical technology. Medical education, there are four main domains I think of when looking at how medical education can actually perpetuate biases and lead to systemic racism in healthcare. It's things like semantics, which is when we use imprecise and non-biologic labels that inaccurately conflate race and ancestry. And on the next slide, I'll kind of go through examples of each of these. Prevalence without context, which is where we present racial and ethnic differences in disease burden without any context to why these things exist. Race-based diagnostic bias, which is when we present links between racial groups in particular diseases, and then pathologizing race, which is our tendency to link minorities with increased disease burdens, once again, without explaining why it may exist or the historical impacts that led to it. Then there's race-based medicine. Medicine for a long time has used race as a determining factor for many different things, that whether that's kidney functioning, heart failure treatment, getting a vaginal birth after C-section, liver cancer screening, all of these things have equations that are built that incorporate race into the equations. And I know one of the questions I get often is like, oh, haven't there been studies done on that? Should that make sense if race is included? But one thing that scientists recognize is that race does not have a biological component. You cannot look at someone's genes and determine what race they are. And especially today, when we are getting more and more diverse, and you can't just look at someone's phenotype and assume what race they are. And you can't assume that their genetics are actually going to match that same thing as well. But yet in medicine, we still do that. We use someone's phenotypic appearance to understand their genotype and what care they may receive. And we then code those into equations that then change how individuals are treated based on their race. So once again, I'll get to these a little bit later, but just want to actually put that out there, is that there are equations that use race that then cause differences in treatment for different populations. And then the last one I like to think about is medical technology as well. Even the technology that we create has the ability to have bias within it. Pulse oximeters are these devices that you put on someone's finger, and they can measure someone's oxygen saturation level. Black patients, in a study that was done recently released again in the New England Journal of Medicine, Black patients had nearly 3 times the frequency of occult hypoxemia that was not detected by pulse oximetry as white patients. What that means is if you put the pulse oximeter on someone, typically you'd want an oxygen saturation level of 98% or to 100%. And for Black patients, sometimes what can happen is it can be overestimated, meaning that you put that pulse ox on, and even though the person is having shortness of breath or their levels may actually be lower than what's actually reading, the pulse oximeter will show higher levels. And that's had significant impacts during the time of COVID, where some people may be having shortness of breath, yet their pulse oximeter is saying that they're getting all the oxygen saturation that they need because it's being overestimated. And we'll dive a little bit more into that later. Then there's things like Google AI Health, looking at images that are put online, and then dermatology as well. If you even just go online and try and look up different skin conditions, you'll have a hard time finding what these conditions look like on different skin colors. Okay, so jumping into each of these, medical education, as I mentioned, I like to think of it in 4 different domains. So the semantics, as I mentioned, was using imprecise and non-biologic labels that inaccurately conflate race and ancestry. An example of how that actually is in medical education is we have widespread use of the words Caucasian, Black, African-American, Asian, and we use those to denote biologic differences between patients. So for example, we might describe a Nigerian patient as African-American in a clinical vignette, but that ignores that there are ancestral differences between these individuals, that someone that is African-American doesn't necessarily have the same ancestral background and lineage as someone that was born in Nigeria. Yet we conflate all of them together. And that prevents us from giving good, tailored, precise care to patients. We also have things like prevalence without context, which is where we present racial, ethnic differences and disease burden without any context. So we often teach students that Black patients have higher rates of asthma than white patients, but we don't reference the effects on asthma prevalence, on residential segregation, or unequal access to high quality housing and healthcare. We also don't talk about redlining and how those impacted where people could live, or that highways are more likely to be near Black neighborhoods because of how, when redlining was going on, how things were kind of split up. All of these things have impacts, but when we teach students that Black patients have higher rates of asthma, instead of actually getting to the context of it, we assume that's something biological instead of something that's systemic and systematic that has been encoded in the systems. Then we have race-based diagnostic bias, when we present links between racial groups and particular diseases. So that's when we prime students to do things like think about sickle cell disease as affecting only Black populations, instead of teaching them that sickle cell is actually common in populations at risk of malaria, which means that that's way more than just the Black population. There's places in India that have higher rates of sickle cell disease than places in Africa, as well as the Middle East. So, and then conversely, that doesn't just have impacts on communities of color, but it also can have impacts on Caucasian populations. Because if we think that cystic fibrosis, for example, only happens in Caucasian patients, we miss it in Black patients. If we think that sickle cell only happens in Black patients, we can miss that in Caucasian populations as well. So when it comes to something like cystic fibrosis, it's often associated with being white, and unfortunately, people that have cystic fibrosis that are Black are less likely to be diagnosed and more likely to die at an early age from it, because oftentimes medical education primes us to think in a certain way, and individuals aren't thinking about that on their differential when looking at a patient. And then last is pathologizing race and race-based clinical guidelines. So, for example, one thing that we do is we teach students that the first line treatment for something like hypertension in Black patients is different than in white patients. But we often don't get exposed to the literature that questions those practices or misleading interpretations that may come out of that. So really what I'm trying to get at with all medical education is understanding that in each of these domains, we're kind of using a shotgun approach to understand how to treat a patient instead of tailoring it to the individual. And there's little fixes that can be made. With semantics, it's as simple as making sure we're specific. With prevalence without context, it's making sure that we just embed those understandings of how has history impacted where we are today, and removing the association between race and disease. With race-based diagnosis bias, really getting to the heart of why are these things more common in specific populations than others, and having a more of an emphasis on ancestry than on race. And with race-based clinical guidelines as well, making sure that we expose everyone to the literature, teach us how to critically think about the studies that have been done, where they're built off of, and how they came about to actually lead to this, and whether those studies had any limitations, whether they were looking at only a subsection of patients. This New York Times article, I encourage everyone to read it, but it's by Linda Villarosa. It talks about myths about physical racial differences that were used to justify slavery and are still believed today by doctors. It goes into kind of the history of slavery and how Black individuals were thought to have thicker skin, to be less prone to experiencing pain. And it's something that still is impact. And Linda really goes in and shows how it still exists today, that these myths from slave time era still impact how students and physicians and healthcare professionals view their patients, whether it's conscious or not. So there was a study done just 5 years ago. Is a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it was a survey of 222 white medical students and residents. And what the study found was that about half of those students endorsed false beliefs about biological differences between Black patients and white patients. And those that did endorse those beliefs also perceived Blacks as feeling less pain than whites, and were more likely to suggest inappropriate medical treatment for Black patients, even though it's a completely false belief. So these disparities extend to gender as well, regardless of race. And it's based on history of sexism, of females as the weaker sex, which is another conversation that we can have another day. But it really goes to show that that racial biases in pain assessment still exist. And they're built about these false beliefs about biological differences that don't exist at all. So I kind of want to transition into the ways that I'm personally trying to tackle this and other medical students are trying to tackle this. I'm on TikTok and Instagram, and I think using personal experiences and sharing how medical education, all these places, all these different institutions are actually causing this to happen is important. So I use things called story times, where I just talk about my own experiences. In this particular video, I talked about how my roommate and I were in a suturing clinic with a physician. The physician came over and we were asking about what different needle sizes to use and when to know when to use them. And the physician said, oh, well, needle sizes correlate with skin thickness. And so in different patients of different races, you're going to have to look at skin thickness and use different needle sizes. And I remember looking at my roommate like, that does not sound right at all. And so we went home and Googled it and found that no, like race does not correlate with different skin thicknesses. But the fact that these providers who were supposed to be teaching us were still perpetuating this was to me absurd. And that's also how things get perpetuated down the line. So I posted that story time video. And after that, I got 782,000 views. And people were commenting on it, saying things like, I've experienced this, or even inside my own life, like I honestly thought that different skin colors, like depending on your skin color, that you had different things, different skin thickness. And so I think it's important to realize that social media now can really highlight these issues and show in real time how they come about and kind of the logical flaws that we have as individuals. So I really think social media is an avenue that can best be used to discuss race disparities and racism in medicine. So if you look at TikTok and Instagram, just as mediums overall, TikTok is AI driven, has an immersive feed, it has editing tools and visual effects, and 59% of users are between 16 to 24. And just recently, they surpassed 1 billion active users. Instagram, on the other hand, also has 1 billion monthly active users. 67% of US adults are aged 18 to 29, and 72% of teens use Instagram. Instagram videos get 2 times as much engagement as photos. So I see both of these mediums and other social media sites too as amazing opportunities to reach young people, to reach the next generation, and to change minds before they kind of have those beliefs that are from all these long-standing systematic issues I've shown ingrained in them. So as you can see in the bottom left, that's my Instagram, and right now over 300,000 followers. But I post videos about what do skin color, how do diseases like Lyme disease look like on different skin color? What does maternal mortality, how does that vary between different patients? What books, if you want to learn more about racial bias in medicine, can you look at? And people have engaged and said amazing things about how it's actually helped them out in terms of understanding. So that's my impact on social media. I have over 300 videos I've created on all sorts of different topics, all related to medicine, but also sometimes going off and doing fun things. But some of my favorite videos are here. In the top left, you see Racial Bias in Medicine, which is a series that I started after hearing about the postdoc seminars that I mentioned. And from there, I've now created 15 different videos that dive deeper and deeper into different ways that biases in medicine exist. I've talked about things like the VBAC calculator, which is the vaginal birth after cesarean calculator, which has an equation that basically says if you're Latinx, if you're Black, you are more likely to have to get a C-section than someone that's white. You can literally use the equation. Thankfully today, and I have a slide on this later, the VBAC calculator has been rewritten in a way that doesn't use race anymore, but it's still for so long, so many patients were subjected to this. It may have gotten a C-section when they didn't want to because of what the equation said. As I mentioned, I've talked about dermatology problems on Black versus white skin. And a lot of people may not realize this, but derm problems don't treat everyone equally. They don't look exactly the same. For Lyme disease, and later I'll show Lash, who's a student talking about this, but for Lyme disease, the bullseye rash that you see doesn't look the same on Black patients and white patients. It looks different. Things like eczema don't look the same. But if you go to Google and try and Google those things, you're not going to find it. I've already talked about spirometry and how that's been encoded into medicine as well, and how spirometry actually uses equations that still today that still today use equations to underestimate the lung functioning of Black patients and Asian patients. And then, as I mentioned, I've talked about story times as well, and how medical education can disproportionately still teach medical students not to recognize these things in a good manner. So this story time in the bottom right that I talked about was about cyanosis, which is when the skin turns blue. And oftentimes we don't use language that is inclusive of all people. Because for someone like myself, who's darker skinned, my skin will never turn blue. So if I'm trying to look at a cyanosis and understanding it, what are other things I'm going to look for? When I ask my teacher, they definitely knew the answers. You want to look at the mucous membranes, you can look at the eyes, you can look at places where you basically wouldn't be having as much fluid, so where you're going to be losing fluid. But unfortunately, it's not the first thing that teachers think about. They always start with the framework of whiteness, of starting there and then working downwards. And that needs to change because the patients that we see disproportionately are people of color, often in hospitals, especially in urban areas. And so understanding that, we should really be putting a focus on everyone and making sure we teach what things look like for all patients. And then the last video that I did was at the top right. And I really like this video because I talk about these two girls, Millie and Marsha. Millie and Marsha, as you can see there in the image, are both twins, but many people would look at them and not necessarily think they're twins because of how they phenotypically present. So Millie and Marsha's dad is Black and their mom is white. But as you can see on the right, one of the sisters is a little bit darker. On the left, one of the sisters is a little bit lighter. They talk about how their experience when they're seen separately, they can actually be mistaken as either being white or being Black, whether they're with their mom or with their dad. And so I kind of go into how racial corrections, depending on how you self-identify, would treat these two girls differently. Would treat these two girls differently, whether it's about GFR or VBAC, just because we use race as a proxy in medicine. So that's kind of an overview of some of the videos I do, but I think it has a huge impact. And the comments kind of show that. People have said things like, I've always thought that Black people's skin is thicker than that of white people, and that Asian skin is thinner compared to white person's skin. People have said that in nursing school, they're not shown skin conditions on dark skin, that medical students from Spain have professors that say things like, it's like that for Black people, but for normal people, or even just saying, I've never thought about this, that this is why people want to go and become doctors now, because they realize that when you don't actually have diverse voices at the table, you're not actually able to make a difference. So if you're not on social media and you have something to say, I actually think this is the best time to get on. You always have an opportunity to create conversations and make a difference. But I also want to talk about some other amazing medical students that are also using different mediums to talk about how medicine needs to change. So this is LaShira Nolan. She was the first female Black medical student body president at Harvard Medical School. She's now a third-year medical student. But she sent out a tweet where she just talked about how she was learning about Lyme disease and its classic symptoms, which are a bullseye rash, which I mentioned, that form around the tick bite. And she asked, a classmate of hers asked, how is this diagnosed for those with darker skin? And the professor actually said, I'm not sure. So she ended up getting tons of retweets off of that, hundreds of thousands of likes on Twitter. And so she went and created and wrote a New England Journal of Medicine article where she talked about her experience walking through the world as a Black woman, being the first Black female student body president at Harvard, and how medical education needs to change because it keeps missing the bullseye. And she's one of the many students that are now taking to social media and using kind of social media, coupling it with research in order to push and change narratives. So what can social media do? It can humanize physicians. It can help build a space for advocacy. It can eliminate barriers for patient education. And it also offers opportunities for mentorship. As I mentioned from the Flexner report, right now, medicine is sorely lacking in diversity. I mean, I think about myself. At my medical school, I was the first Black medical student at my school. And granted, my school was pretty new. It was only been around for 4 to 5 years, but it still shocked me. And only this year did we have our first Black female medical student. And unfortunately, that is common across medicine, where less than 5% of physicians are Black. And so creating opportunities for mentorship when you're able to show yourself as someone that's open to mentoring others is huge. But also making sure that people can hear your voice and that you're being honest and show that, yes, there are problems in medicine, here's where they are, but I'm actually doing something to change the system overall. So all these things are important for social media. I mentioned a little bit about race-based medical educations, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into them because I think it's an important way to really understand things that are easy to grasp, that people can see, that can be talked about on social media as well. So there's four different kind of metrics I wanted to use that in which equations use race still that can lead to differing outcomes for patients. The first is glomerular filtration rate. GFR is basically a measure of how well our kidneys are functioning. But for the equation to measure GFR, there's a race adjustment. What that race adjustment does is it increases the GFR for Black patients, meaning that meaning that you're assuming that a Black individual's GFR numbers are better, that they have better kidney functioning. What that race correction can do is it might overestimate GFR. And that many people have said that may result in Black patients not getting necessary care and missing necessary treatments that they need as well. Another place, as I mentioned before, is a vaginal birth after cesarean. Just to repeat it, it has only two race-based correction factors, one for African-American women, another for Hispanic women. The correction factors subtract from the overall likelihood of a successful vaginal birth after a C-section. So women that identify as African-American or Hispanic are systemically assigned a lower chance of successful VBAC than a white woman, meaning they're more likely to get a C-section. NFL concussion payouts. And I think this one's important because it shows that it's not just in medicine that these things have impacts. It's also in society and how medicine does go on to impact kind of people and whether they get paid in a sense. So this NFL policy assumed that Black players had lower cognitive functioning compared to non-Black players. So when doctors were evaluating someone that had a concussion, they had to actually take this correction into account and reduce the score. So that made it more difficult for Black NFL players to receive the equal compensation for their injuries because they had to show worse cognitive functioning than white players. In a study done when the Black correction factors were put on many white patients, 10 of them wouldn't have received the concussion payouts that they had. But when they used the kind of quote unquote white racial corrections, all of them would have received their payouts. So it goes to show that these things also have an impact on finances, on the politics and kind of economic impacts as well. Then lastly, heart failure. Race is considered as a factor when evaluating heart failure. 3 points are added to the risk score if a patient is identified as non-Black. And when that addition increases the estimated probability of death for non-Black patients with acute heart failure, meaning that if you are non-Black, you are more likely to have a higher risk of heart failure, which means you would be put on the top of the list for getting different late stage, what's the word I'm looking for? Late stage treatment for things as opposed to a Black patient who would have to show, once again, worse functioning of their heart than other patients. So as we see in each of these places, there are multiple examples of how race and using race in it, even though we know that race has no biologic standing, can significantly impact the care that people receive and even impact the economic benefits that specific patients have. And getting back to medical technology, I've already talked about pulse oximeters and how they can overestimate oxygen levels compared to white patients, but also even looking at things like Google. When you go online and Google a specific dermatology condition, you're not going to find dark skin types. And recently, Google created an AI app, which was supposed to be a tool to help diagnose skin conditions. But when you actually looked at the research that they published, they only had less than 4% of dark skin types included in the system. Meaning that if you're using this Google AI Health and you're Black, it doesn't really have that much of a data bank to actually aggregate from and look at in order to diagnose you. So the chances for you being misdiagnosed are higher than your white counterparts. And so medical technology is huge as well because we use this for everything. And once it's created, we often take it for what it is. We don't look back at it and say, where are the limitations, where are the problems with this necessarily? Thankfully, a lot of these things are starting to come to light and change just in the past, honestly, 5 years. So for GFR, for example, a new creatinine and cystatin C equation has been created that doesn't use race anymore. So if you remember, GFR relates to kidney functioning. So now they're actually taking race out of it completely. Researchers also are removing race from the childbirth calculator, so the VBAC calculator. And so now a new calculator has been created that doesn't use that. And for the race norming that was built into the NFL concussion settlements, many of those people are going back and actually having their cases heard in court, where they're now taking out the racial correction that was used and seeing if these players would have actually been able to get that payout that they may have deserved before. And students, once again, are the ones that are kind of leading the charge. So this student is Naomi. She's a student at University of Washington, and she was one of the students who really was leading the charge on changing GFR, specifically at University of Washington. University of Washington became one of the first institutions to get rid of GFR as a measure of kidney function, the one that uses the race correction. And once University of Washington did it, the other schools said, hey, we can do this too. And when asked about how she was able to make the change, Naomi said, we made it by questioning lecturers. We did it by not letting the issue go and continuing to push discussions in class about the use of this equation. And then having meetings with teaching faculty, sending articles to them like the one in JAMA that were already looking at these issues, forcing discussions, and making use of advocacy. And so medical students right now, especially Black medical students, who see ourselves and see that the way in which medicine is disproportionately treating people that look like us, are now coming in and say, I'm going to not just be a medical student, I'm going to be an advocate and an activist. Look at the ways that we can change this and see if there's actually any scientific standard to this, or whether it may be doing more harm than good. So overall, social media and individuals that are kind of this next generation are focused on being a voice for patients. We're focused on health policy, changing the things that exist, creating better health outcomes, making sure we educate patients, and demonstrating leadership skills where we are really trying to take charge and make sure that we can change a system that has for a long time not been interrupted. And what that means to change a system is to understand kind of the difference between equality, equity, and justice and liberation. I love this picture because I think it does a really, really good job of displaying the differences between each of these. Equality is the assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports. It's equal treatment. Equity is everyone gets the supports they need, while justice is everyone can see the band perform on the other side without supports. So right now, equality, we kind of give everyone the same supports, but as we can see here, everyone comes from a different place. Everyone's at a different height. Sometimes equality isn't enough. Equity is making sure they get the support they need so that the person in the yellow there, even though they were kind of start off a different place, they're able to get to where they need to be to actually be able to see and get to the other side. Justice is where we kind of want to go, where we don't even need the supports or accommodations because the inequity was addressed overall. And then we have the systemic barriers that have been removed or corrected. In liberation, there aren't barriers at all. And of course, it's hard to get to justice and liberation. And where we're at right now is more equity. So remember, equality is not the same as equity, and ultimately we're striving for justice. So how do we actually attain health equity? There's different ways. And when talking to kind of hospitals, it's about hiring a diverse healthcare workforce because these people can actually see the change that need to be made, training staff to better understand what creates a healthy community, moving from race-based medicine, which is used right now, to race-conscious medicine, which is where we understand how race impacts us, but doesn't necessarily use race as a prognostic factor for making a determine the final diagnosis. And then always considering the structural and social determinants of a disease when discussing the causes of unequal disease burden. So it's really about focusing on health interventions and initiatives on communities that are most impacted by health disparities. So in summary, as we've seen, history's influence on disparities still exists today, but we have so many opportunities to address them, whether that's through social media, through discussions, through simply through writing articles. And medical students today are still doing this and trying to create a healthier future for ourselves, our patients, and our communities. So thank you so much, and I'll open up to questions.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Joel. We'll now like to open the floor up for questions. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat. We have one question from Sandy. Do you know why diabetes is considered more prevalent among African Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't be able to actually have a direct answer to that, but I think you can look at kind of factors that contribute to diabetes. So things like weight gain, or so think about access to these different places. If you are in a food desert, for example, you're not going to have access to healthier foods that you need. Looking at kind of where people come from and even understanding, is it actually a race issue? Is it actually Black individuals are more likely to have diabetes? Or is it something like people that live in areas that don't have access to foods are more likely to have diabetes, you know? And so I think one thing I always try to move away from is even relating and connecting these things between race and kind of these diabetes and hypertension, things like that, but really understanding, why do these things come about? What's the historical legacy? So like I said, looking at food deserts, looking at the areas that people come from. Do you have access to a gym? Are you able to actually go to a gym? Because exercise can reduce the likelihood of diabetes. Are you working a job that maybe you don't have time for yourself, or where you can't cook for yourself, you have to get food from outside? All of these things kind of are contributing factors to thinking about just healthcare, and how many of the things that we think about that are often not really racially connected come from different places, and just the social terms of health that may impact it.
Thank you. We have another question. Would you say more about how you think medical education can help move from race-based to race-conscious medicine?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, race-based is about where we kind of use race as that final determining factor for everything. So GFR, the fact that we have a multiplier. If we moved from race-based to race-conscious, a race-conscious approach would be, we aren't using GFR equations that adjust for race anymore. Or thinking about BMI risk for diabetes. If when we think about how race is used, Asian patients right now are considered at risk for diabetes at a different BMI than for other races. But in a race-conscious approach, we would screen patients with lower BMIs on the basis of indications of increased body fat, not based on race. So really, it's about taking race out of the equation overall, where we recognize that the legacies that lead up to this have impacted, because race doesn't have biological impacts, but it does have social impacts that then lead to biological impacts. And so for me, it's about understanding how do we understand how race as a social construct has been used to create power dynamics, and then taking that, separating that out in the equation from the biology, if that makes sense.
We have another question. I am interested in how you feel about the term diversity in medical areas. For example, I just heard a presentation by a publisher where they were proud of the amount of books on derm that included POC. For me, that's just practical and correcting something.
Yeah, Catherine, I totally agree. I think it's been interesting how diversity has become this thing that we're proud of, when it shouldn't have even been something that we have to be proud of. It should be natural. We live in a diverse world, but unfortunately, especially in medicine, the things that are out there don't reflect kind of that diversity. And so for something like that, where people are now proud of, oh, we're putting out more books on derm that include POC, why wasn't this done in the first place? And so I'm happy. I'm really, like, don't get me wrong, I'm really happy that diversity is now being talked about more. But I also don't want it to be something where we say, oh, wonderful, we've done our job, check, our diversity quotient or whatever quota has been checked, and now we can move on. I hope it's something that we continually work towards and realize that it's not about necessarily adding that diversity. It's making sure that we don't even have to get to a place where we say, is this book having enough diversity, that it's just naturally there, and it's automatically assumed.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. The next question states, do you have suggestions for recruiting more diverse employees, such as in the healthcare field?
Mm-hmm. I always think about like the pipelines that get people into specific careers. And I think when it comes to recruiting more diverse employees, you have to start early. So there's three different things that people are gonna be looking at. And this is what I was looking at when I came to my medical school. One, is this place going to be somewhere that's safe for someone that's a person of color? AKA, do you already have people that are there that are diverse employees? If you don't have people that are there, you're going to have a hard time recruiting people because they're going to look in and say, this place is not a safe place for me. 2, are you actively doing the work to go back to communities that have been overlooked or schools that have been overlooked that have great candidates? So things like historically Black colleges and universities, but have often been kind of skipped over because HBCUs aren't seen as quote unquote rigorous, even though they have the same education system. So are you going to places like that? And then 3, once people get in kind of this system, are you really trying to make sure that they're reaching back and tapping their networks as well? This idea of kind of reaching in, but then also reaching back to bring people in. So when it comes to recruiting more diverse employees, I think it starts with making sure that, 1, you are having a diverse workforce. And if you don't have one right now, doing the work of just reaching out to different organizations. There are so many amazing organizations that are for students of color that are within the healthcare field. I think reaching out to those places, figuring out where students are, reaching them early, because it's not just about finding them kind of right before they're getting into the workforce, but also getting them to the workforce in the first place. So looking at programs you can be doing in middle schools and high schools within the community to really engage. But I think it has to be a full kind of 360 view of understanding that the entire system of getting more diverse employees doesn't just start when they're applying, but starts before that. And companies need to really do a better job of encouraging people early on.
Joel, we have more questions rolling in and some great feedback for you in the chat, but unfortunately we just have time for this last question. When talking about disease burden across race, can you provide examples of adding context to those statistics to provide a more accurate picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess the one I usually go to is, let me think. I guess, yeah, so sickle cell I like to use a lot. I think I mentioned this really briefly, but with sickle cell, we see that it's more common in Black populations. But it's not just that because they're Black that you have sickle cell. It's that sickle cell has an allele, and that allele predisposes you to being resistant to malaria. And so that gene was kept around for a long time based on people ancestrally that were from one area. And so malaria, however, isn't just in Africa, right? And I wish I had the map with me, but there's a map that I like to show that really shows that sickle cell is spread between kind of Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, then also in India and the Middle East. And so when we think about something like that, we're limiting ourselves to think about sickle cell as something that only impacts Black patients when there's a whole swath of other patients that are also impacted. And so really understanding that. And if you email me, I can definitely send you some more statistics that aren't coming to mind right now, but I definitely have some more.
Perfect. We really appreciate you, Joel. This has been just an exceptional presentation. On behalf of NNLM Region 3 and on behalf of all the folks that are here participating today, I just want to say thank you for your presentation and for your time. And to everyone that was able to attend, it was a pleasure to have all of you with us.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.